Nobody wakes up one morning and decides to fail. That is the thing nobody talks about when they talk about failure. Failure, in the version most people are living, does not announce itself. It does not arrive with a clear signal, a dramatic turning point, a moment you can point to later and say, that is when it started. It arrives the way fog arrives, so gradually, so quietly, so incrementally that by the time the air is thick with it, you have already forgotten what clarity felt like. The person who is quietly failing is not someone in obvious distress. They are not visibly self-destructing. They are not making catastrophic decisions or burning their life down in ways that anyone around them would recognize as crisis. They are doing something far more common and far more dangerous. They are living their life slightly below the level of what they know they are capable of every day, in ways that individually feel insignificant and collectively amount to a kind of silent erosion that most people never fully reckon with until a significant amount of time has already passed. You might be one of them, not because you are broken or hopeless or fundamentally incapable of more, but because quiet failure is the default mode of modern life for the majority of capable, intelligent, well-intentioned people who simply never had the specific, honest, uncomfortable conversation that this audiobook is going to have with you right now. This is that conversation. You are not here by accident. The fact that this title resonated, that the description felt personally addressed, that something in the opening felt more accurate than comfortable, that is the part of you that already knows, the part that has been running a quiet background assessment for longer than you have been willing to consciously acknowledge reaching a conclusion. You have been softening and rationalizing and setting aside because the full weight of it, unmodified, is too much to sit with while also maintaining the comfortable version of your daily life. This audiobook will not let you set it aside, not because discomfort is the goal, it is not, but because the only path from the life that is quietly failing to the life that is not runs directly through the truth of what the quiet failing actually is, and the truth, honestly received, changes things in a way that nothing softer can. Chapter 1. The failure that does not look like failure. Here is what quiet failure looks like from the outside. It looks like a normal life, a life with a job that pays reasonably well, relationships that are more or less functional, a living situation that is adequate, a routine that keeps things moving. It does not look like poverty or addiction or obvious crisis. It does not look like the dramatic failure that gets documented, discussed, diagnosed, and addressed. It looks, from most angles, like a person who is doing okay. From the inside, though, something is different. There is a quality to the days that does not quite sit right, a low-level dissatisfaction that has been present long enough that it no longer feels like dissatisfaction. It just feels like how things are, a sense recurring and unwelcome and quickly suppressed that the version of your life you are actually living and the version of your life you are capable of living are not the same thing, and that the distance between them has been quietly growing for longer than you want to measure. This is the signature of quiet failure, not the presence of obvious problems, the absence of genuine progress towards something that actually matters, the slow accumulation of days that were okay but not purposeful, weeks that passed without producing anything real, years that moved without the person inside them moving meaningfully with them. The tragedy of quiet failure is not that it hurts dramatically, it is that it barely hurts at all, at least not in a way that demands immediate attention. The pain is diffuse, ambient, manageable, the kind of pain that can be addressed with the right entertainment, the right distraction, the right way of framing things to make the current situation seem more acceptable than honest assessment would allow. This is precisely what makes it so dangerous. Dramatic failure is actually easier to address in some ways because dramatic failure creates urgency. When the consequences are immediate and severe, the motivation to change is immediate and severe. But quiet failure produces no urgency, The consequences are deferred, distributed across time in portions too small to register clearly as consequences at all. And without urgency, the comfortable adaptation continues. Most people who are quietly failing are not failing because they are lazy or stupid or fundamentally incapable. They are failing because the failure is not loud enough to interrupt the comfort. And comfort, reliably, is louder than everything except crisis. The quiet failure has another property that makes it particularly insidious. It coexists with perfect ease, with genuine effort. The person who is quietly failing is often working hard at something. They just are not working hard at the things that would make the critical difference. They are producing real effort in the service of maintaining rather than building, of managing rather than advancing, of keeping the current situation stable rather than growing toward the situation they actually want. This coexistence of genuine effort and quiet failure is why the failure does not feel like failure from the inside. Effort feels like progress, even when the effort is not pointed in a direction that produces it. Busyness feels like productivity, even when the busyness is not building toward the life that the person, in their honest moments, recognizes as the one they want to be living. And the most insidious feature of all, quiet failure is comfortable. The life of quiet failure is not an obviously bad life. It contains genuine pleasures, genuine connections, genuine moments of satisfaction and ease. It does not feel like a trap because it does not look like a trap. It looks like a life. A reasonable, manageable, adequately pleasant life. The trap is not the life itself. It is the distance between that life and the one that was possible. And that distance, invisible from inside the comfort of the current arrangement, is what this audiobook is about. Chapter 2. What is actually happening beneath the surface? The quiet failure does not happen randomly. It is not the result of bad luck or arbitrary circumstance. It is the output of a specific set of internal mechanisms, patterns, habits, beliefs, and adaptations that are operating with perfect consistency to produce exactly the results they were always going to produce. Understanding these mechanisms is the beginning of addressing them. Not because understanding alone changes anything, it does not, but because action without understanding tends to be misdirected, addressing the symptoms of the pattern while the pattern itself continues running unchanged beneath the surface. The first mechanism is the gradual lowering of the standard. Every person carries an internal standard, a sense of what they consider acceptable for their own performance, their own habits, their own level of engagement with the life they are living. This standard is not fixed, it is dynamic, and it responds with quiet consistency to what the person regularly accepts from themselves. When you let a standard slip once and nothing dramatic happens, the new lower level becomes, temporarily, the new reference point. When it slips again and nothing dramatic happens, the reference point moves again. This process is gradual enough to be nearly invisible at the individual step, but visible in aggregate when enough steps have accumulated to produce a clearly lower standard than existed at some earlier point. The person who once held themselves to the standard of daily exercise now considers 3 times a week adequate. The person who once aimed for genuine career development now considers showing up and doing the minimum acceptable. The person who once had a vision of something they wanted to build now considers the vision itself to be evidence of youthful naivety rather than legitimate aspiration. These are not decisions. They are adaptations, and they compound across every domain simultaneously: the body, the mind, the career, the creative life, the quality of presence in relationships, until the accumulated lowering of standards across all domains produces a life that is measurably below what was possible and felt from the inside inevitable rather than chosen. The second mechanism is the accumulation of rationalizations. Every lowering of the standard comes with a story. The story makes the lowering feel reasonable, even wise. It was not the right time. The conditions were not favorable. Other priorities legitimately required the attention that the higher standard would have demanded. The expectation itself was unrealistic, and the current standard is more mature, more realistic, more appropriate to the actual demands of adult life. These stories are not entirely false. They are partial truths that have been elevated to complete explanations. Sometimes the timing genuinely was not right. Sometimes other priorities genuinely were legitimately higher. But the pattern of always having a story available, always having a reason why this particular standard, this particular commitment, this particular aspiration had to give way to something else, is not the operation of wise adult realism. It is the operation of a self-protection system that has learned to speak in the language of wisdom. Rationalizations are the vocabulary of quiet failure. They are how the failure maintains its deniability, because the person who is quietly failing is rarely failing in ways they cannot explain. They have explanations for everything. The explanations are even individually reasonable. It is only the pattern of explanations accumulated across years of the same mechanism operating in the same direction that reveals what the explanations are actually doing. The third mechanism is the confusion of activity with progress. Quiet failure is almost always accompanied by genuine busyness. The person who is quietly failing is not, in most cases, sitting idle. They are managing the demands of work and relationships and the ordinary maintenance of daily life. They are doing things consistently with real effort and real attention. But the things being done are not building toward the life they want to be living. They are maintaining the life they are currently in, and maintenance, however effortful, is not progress. The busyness provides a sense of productivity that quiets the alarm that would otherwise sound more loudly, the alarm that nothing important is actually being built. The activity creates the feeling of momentum without the substance of it. The fourth mechanism is the normalization of the drift. Over time, the quietly failing life stops feeling like failure and starts feeling like ordinary life. The low-level dissatisfaction that was once a signal of genuine discrepancy becomes so familiar that it is no longer experienced as a signal at all. It becomes background noise, always present, no longer informative, no longer urgent enough to act on. This normalization is perhaps the most effective feature of quiet failure because it removes the experiential feedback that would otherwise motivate change. The discomfort of the gap between what is and what could be, which is the information that should be driving action, is gradually habituated away. And once it is gone, the quiet failure is not only invisible to others, it is invisible to the person living it. Chapter 3. The comfort that is costing you everything. At the center of quiet failure, in almost every case, is something that does not feel like a problem. It feels like relief. It feels like rest. It feels, on the days when the choice presents itself most clearly, like the obviously reasonable option given how tired you are and how much you have already done and how far away the future payoff still seems. It is comfort, specifically, the comfort of not pushing past your own resistance, the comfort of choosing the easier option when the harder one was available, the comfort of stopping when stopping was possible, even when continuing was what the situation actually called for. The comfort of the familiar over the unfamiliar, the known over the unknown, the safe over the growth requiring. This comfort is not evil. It is not weakness in the simple sense. It is the natural, understandable biological preference of a nervous system that is designed to conserve energy and avoid unnecessary risk. The preference for comfort is not a character defect. It is a feature of human neurological architecture that served the species well in environments where energy conservation and risk avoidance were more directly connected to survival than they are in the modern context. But in the modern context, where the most important challenges are not physical threats, but the sustained effort of developing skills, building things, maintaining direction over long periods, tolerating the discomfort of growth. The preference for comfort has a specific cost that its evolutionary origin did not prepare it to account for. The cost is the slow erosion of everything that requires discomfort to build, because almost everything that constitutes genuine development requires sustained discomfort, not the dramatic, acute discomfort of crisis, the low-level, chronic, grinding discomfort of doing hard things regularly without immediate reward, of practicing a skill past the point where practice is enjoyable, of pursuing a goal past the point where the initial motivation has faded, of maintaining a standard past the point where lowering it would be immediately relieving. The comfort that is costing you everything is not the comfort of rest. Genuine rest is necessary and not the enemy. It is the comfort of avoidance, the comfort that is chosen not because it serves recovery, but because it serves the avoidance of the specific discomfort that growth requires. And the difference between the two, between rest that restores and comfort that avoids, is something that most people, if they are honest, can feel. The rest leaves you ready. The comfort leaves you safe, and safety, in the context of a life trying to become something, is indistinguishable from stagnation. There is a compounding element to comfort seeking that makes it particularly corrosive over time. Each choice of comfort over growth slightly lowers the tolerance for the discomfort of growth, and a lower tolerance means that the same level of growth discomfort feels more difficult the next time it is encountered, which makes the comfort-seeking response more likely, which lowers the tolerance further. The person who avoids discomfort consistently becomes progressively less capable of tolerating it, not because they are becoming weaker in some absolute sense, but because the tolerance, like a muscle, atrophies with disuse. This is why people who've been quietly failing for extended periods often find the idea of significant change so daunting. It is not that the change is objectively more difficult for them than it would have been earlier. It is that their tolerance for the discomfort of growth has been progressively reduced by years of comfort seeking. The first step back toward genuine development is not just one step. It is one step taken by a person whose capacity for discomfort has been diminished by the accumulated avoidance. Understanding this does not make the starting harder. It makes the starting more urgent, because every day of continued comfort-seeking further reduces the tolerance that the starting will require. The longer the wait, the harder the beginning. And the harder the beginning, the stronger the temptation to wait a bit longer still. Every day in which the comfort of avoidance is chosen over the discomfort of growth is a day in which the quiet failure continues and the beginning becomes marginally more difficult. This is one of the most honest and most uncomfortable truths about quiet failure, and it is the one that should make the decision to begin feel genuinely urgent. Chapter 4. The stories you are telling yourself. Quiet failure is narrative. It runs on stories, specific, personally tailored, deeply convincing stories about why the current situation is acceptable, why change is not currently possible, why the person who is living this particular version of a smaller life is actually being realistic rather than settling. These stories are worth examining directly, not to shame the person telling them. The stories are not evidence of stupidity or weakness. They are evidence of the sophistication of the self-protection system that generates them. But sophistication does not equal truth, and a story that is sophisticated enough to be convincing is not the same as a story that is accurate enough to be useful. The first story is the story of not being ready. This story has an almost infinite variety of specific forms, but they all share the same structure. There is something, a quality, a resource, a circumstance, a level of preparation that needs to be in place before the important thing can begin, and that something is not yet present. So the beginning is deferred to a future moment when the missing element will have arrived. The story of not being ready is the most durable story in the quiet failure repertoire because it is future-oriented. It does not deny the desire for change. It does not deny the capacity for change. It simply postpones it, always to a future that is defined just vaguely enough that its arrival cannot be definitively tracked and its non-arrival cannot be definitively confronted. The person is not giving up, they are waiting. And waiting, unlike giving up, does not require acknowledging that anything is wrong. The problem with waiting for readiness is that readiness, in the sense this story requires it, never fully arrives. The conditions that would make the difficult thing feel comfortable are not coming. The resources that would make the investment feel safe are not accumulating to a level at which safety is guaranteed. The internal preparation that would make the attempt feel certain of success is not achievable in advance of the attempt. Readiness is not a state that precedes trying. It is a state that follows it, and only follows it if the trying was sustained through the period when it was not yet present. The second story is the story of uniquely difficult circumstances. This story acknowledges that change is possible in principle, but maintains that the specific circumstances of the specific person's life make the general principle inapplicable here. Other people can build consistent habits because their lives are less demanding. Other people can pursue ambitious goals because their responsibilities are less constraining. Other people can make the investment in their own development because they have more time, more money, more support, more energy, more of whatever the current situation seems to require. The uniquely difficult circumstances story is sustained by selective attention. It focuses on the ways in which the person's circumstances genuinely are demanding, and of most people's circumstances are genuinely demanding, while not attending to the ways in which those circumstances are also at least partially the result of choices made and priorities set. And it compares consistently the internal experience of one's own situation to the external presentation of others, which is always a comparison that makes the internal feel worse. Every person's circumstances contain genuine difficulty. That is not a story, that is reality. But the jump from genuine difficulty to uniquely prohibitive difficulty is where the story enters, and the story, once established, has a remarkable tendency to find new evidence of its own truth in every circumstance that presents itself. The third story is the story of fundamental limitation. This is the deepest and most damaging story in the Quiet Failure collection. It is the story that the current level of performance, achievement, and engagement is not the result of choices being made. It is the result of what this particular person is actually capable of. They are not settling. They are being honest about their own ceiling. The ambition that they once had was not realism. It was the ignorance of someone who had not yet discovered the actual extent of their limitations. This story is the most dangerous because it converts a pattern of choices into a fact of nature. It takes the accumulated result of years of comfort-seeking and standard-lowering and rationalizing and presents it as evidence of inherent incapacity. And once a person has accepted the story of their own fundamental limitation, the motivation to test that story, to attempt the difficult thing, to push past the current ceiling and find out whether the ceiling was real, disappears. What makes this story particularly insidious is that it is not entirely invented. There are real limitations. Every person has capacities that are genuinely constrained by factors they did not choose. The specifics of their neurology, their history, their circumstances. But the story of fundamental limitation overstates what is fixed and understates what is fixed and understates what is malleable. It treats the result of years of not pushing the ceiling as evidence of where the ceiling is, when in fact the only reliable way to locate the ceiling is to push against it, and the story prevents precisely that. Every one of these stories needs to be met with the same specific question. Is this a description of reality, or is this a story that is protecting me from having to confront reality? Chapter 5. The environment that is running your behavior here is something that most people who are quietly failing never fully examine: the degree to which their behavior is being produced, not by their choices, but by their environment. The word choice implies an active, deliberate, conscious selection between available options. But most of what people do in a day is not the result of this kind of active deliberation. It is the result of following the path of least resistance within their existing environment. The environment, physical, social, digital, temporal, is not neutral. It actively shapes behavior through the specific paths it makes easy and the specific paths it makes difficult. And for most people, the environment they inhabit has been configured through years of accumulated habit and default to make the behaviors of quiet failure extremely easy and the behaviors of genuine development substantially harder. The phone is accessible at every moment of potential discomfort or boredom, which means the alternative to distraction, sitting with discomfort long enough for something productive to emerge from it, is rarely experienced. The social environment is peopled primarily with others who are operating at a similar level of engagement and ambition, which means the modeling of what is normal reinforces the current level rather than challenging it. The physical environment contains the food, the furniture, the screens, and the arrangements that make the comfort-seeking behavior the automatic default rather than the considered exception. In this environment, the person who is quietly failing does not experience themselves as making bad choices. They experience themselves as living normally, because the environment defines normal, and their environment has been gradually, imperceptibly configured around the accumulated choices that produced the quiet failure in the first place. The environment and the behavior form a feedback loop. The behavior is produced by the environment. The environment is maintained by the behavior. The loop is self-sustaining and largely invisible to the person inside it, because from inside the loop, the environment just looks like how things are and the behavior just looks like what people do. Here is the practical implication of this. Most people who try to address quiet failure do so by attempting to make better choices inside the existing environment. They try to use more willpower, more motivation, more discipline to override the defaults that the environment is producing. And they fail, not because they lack willpower, not because they are not trying hard enough, but because individual choice is fighting the current of the existing system with a finite resource that runs out. The environment keeps winning because the environment is always there, always presenting the same defaults, always making the same behaviors easy and the same alternatives hard. Willpower is not a sustainable strategy against a poorly designed environment. It is a temporary override of a system that is already in place, and temporary overrides applied to permanent systems produce temporary results. What actually changes behavior sustainably is changing the environment that produces it, making the important behaviors easier, reducing the friction between the person and the practice they want to maintain, making the unimportant behaviors harder, increasing the friction between the person and the default that has been substituting for the practice, restructuring the physical, digital, and social environment so that the path of least resistance leads somewhere worth going. This is not easy, but it is a fundamentally different kind of difficult from the daily willpower battle. It is a design challenge rather than an endurance challenge. And design challenges, once solved, stay solved, at least until the environment drifts back toward its previous configuration, at which point the design needs refreshing. The person who wants to stop quietly failing needs to examine their environment with the same honest attention they bring to their behavior. Because the environment is producing the behavior, and the behavior is producing the life. Change the environment, and the life follows, not instantly, not without effort, but reliably. Chapter 6: The Social Mirror and What It Is Showing You. There is a dimension of quiet failure that is less internal than most people assume, and it operates through one of the most powerful influences on human behavior available, the behavior of other people. Human beings are deeply social in a way that goes far beyond preference. The social environment does not just influence behavior, it largely defines what behavior seems normal, appropriate, acceptable, and worth attempting. The standards that the people around you hold, the level of effort they apply, the ambitions they pursue, the habits they maintain, the standards they hold themselves to, become, through the mechanism of social learning and the constant operation of comparison, the implicit reference point for what is normal and therefore acceptable for you. If the people you spend the most time with are operating at a certain level of ambition, effort, and self-investment, that level feels like the normal range. Anything significantly above it feels like extraordinary effort. Admirable, perhaps, but not expected and certainly not the standard by which to measure yourself. Anything significantly below it feels like obvious failure. But the normal range itself, the level at which ordinary people in your specific social environment operate, is not examined against any external standard. It is simply experienced as normal. For many people, the social normal that has been absorbed from their primary environment is a level of quiet failure that is shared widely enough to feel like ordinary life. The people around them are also scrolling rather than building, also postponing rather than beginning, also maintaining rather than developing. The shared mediocrity does not feel like mediocrity from inside it. It feels like realistic living. It feels like what adult life actually is. Once you are past the naive ambition of youth and into the honest reckoning of how things actually work, this social normalization of quiet failure is one of its most effective maintenance mechanisms because it removes the visibility of the failure entirely. If everyone around you is operating at the same level, there is no contrast against which the level can be evaluated. The fish does not notice the water. What shifts this is contact with people who are operating at a different level. Not people who are dramatically more successful in ways that feel irrelevant or alienating. That contact produces envy and discouragement rather than recalibration. But people who are genuinely invested in their own development, genuinely building something that matters to them, genuinely holding themselves to a higher standard than the ambient social normal. People whose example makes the possible more visible and the current level less comfortable than the shared environment was allowing it to be. This is why the relational environment matters so profoundly for breaking out of quiet failure. Not because other people are responsible for your outcomes. They are not, but because the people you spend the most time with are co-authoring your definition of normal. And normal, as long as it is set by an environment of shared quiet failure, will keep producing exactly what it has been producing. The inverse is also true, and worth stating directly. When you begin to change, when you begin to take your own development seriously in a way that differs from the ambient social norm, the social environment will frequently push back. Not always consciously or maliciously, but through the subtle, powerful mechanism of social comfort. The people around you who have not changed will be more comfortable with a version of you that also had not changed. Your growth is, implicitly, a comment on their non-growth. And that comment, even when it is not intended and not stated, is felt. This social friction is one of the most predictable features of breaking out of quiet failure, and one of the least discussed, because discussing it requires acknowledging something uncomfortable about the relationships that have been sources of genuine comfort and connection. But the acknowledgement is necessary, because the friction will come. And if it is not anticipated, it will be experienced as evidence that the change is wrong, rather than as evidence that the change is real. The social environment is a mirror. Right now, it is showing you approximately what the people around you are doing. As you change, what it shows you will change. And that is exactly as it should be. Chapter 7. The specific cost of quiet failure, because quiet failure does not feel like failure. Most people who are living it never fully account for what it actually costs. The cost exists, it is real and accumulating, but it is denominated in a currency that is difficult to track, not in immediate pain or visible loss, but in the slow erosion of possibility, capacity, and time. Understanding the cost clearly is not an exercise in self-punishment. It is the necessary work of honest accounting. And honest accounting, in the context of the comparison between continuing the current pattern and changing it, is what makes the comparison real rather than abstract. The first cost is time, and it is the most irreversible. Every year of quiet failure is a year in which the primary project was not built. The primary skill was not developed. The primary version of your life was not lived. These years do not accumulate as neutral time. They accumulate as the specific loss of what could have been built, developed, and lived in them. And unlike other losses, the loss of time cannot be recovered. The money that was not invested can be invested later. The skill that was not developed can be developed later at greater cost in effort. But the year that passed in drift is simply gone. And the compounding that would have started in that year now starts several years later, with all the cost of the delay built in. Most people acknowledge the time cost in the abstract, but do not feel it as a present reality. It sits in the future, where the consequences live, in the same vague territory as retirement and legacy and all the other things that are real and important and perpetually not urgent. The skill of bringing the future cost into present, felt experience, of making the passing of time a real, visceral, motivating fact rather than a theoretical awareness, is the skill that makes the decision to change feel genuinely urgent rather than intellectually endorsed, but practically deferred. The second cost is capacity, the things that constitute genuine human development. Physical vitality, cognitive sharpness, emotional range, creative capacity do not stay constant in the absence of active investment. They decline, not always dramatically, not always visibly, but consistently, and in a direction that is harder and harder to reverse the longer the decline has continued. The body that is not trained loses fitness that becomes genuinely harder to regain as time passes. Not impossible to regain, that is the comfortable story, but harder. The mind that is not seriously challenged loses the particular edge that serious challenge maintains. The creative capacity that is not regularly exercised produces with increasing consistency less than it was capable of producing. The emotional range that is never stretched by difficult experience or deliberate practice narrows to the comfortable middle ground. Quiet failure, in other words, is not a stable equilibrium. It is a slow decline dressed as stability. The person who stays in quiet failure for 5 more years is not in the same position at the end of those years as at the beginning. They are in a worse position, not dramatically, but measurably, in terms of the capacity available to them for the eventual, inevitable attempt at something different. The third cost is identity. Every year of living below your own standard produces evidence, private evidence. Evidence not about what you have done or what has happened to you, but about what kind of person you are. Specifically, about whether you are the kind of person who can be trusted to do what they say they will do to sustain effort through difficulty to build something real from genuine sustained investment. This evidence accumulates below the level of conscious accounting but operates continuously on the self-concept. And the self-concept that is built on years of evidence that the important things keep not being done is not a neutral starting point for the next attempt. It is a heavily biased starting point, one that interprets early difficulty as confirmation of incapacity that applies the previous pattern as a predictive template for the next one. That makes the non-negotiable decision genuinely harder to make because the track record that would make it credible does not exist. The fourth cost is possibility itself. The life that is possible from your current position is not the same as it was 5 years ago. Some of the specific possibilities that existed at that earlier point have genuinely narrowed. Through time, through the skill gaps that quiet failure allowed to grow, through the relational shifts that happen when you are not growing and the people who are continue forward without you. This is not cause for despair. It is cause for honest recognition that the accounting is not neutral. that every year of quiet failure has a real cost in the range of what is subsequently possible. And that recognition made now, while the range is still wide, is worth considerably more than recognition made later when it is narrowed further. The cost of quiet failure, honestly totaled across these 4 dimensions, is not small. It is one of the most significant costs available in a human life, precisely because it is paid so gradually and so invisibly that most people finish paying much of it before they have fully noticed that the transaction was happening. Chapter 8. Why most people never change. The honest version. Having understood the mechanisms of quiet failure, the lowering standards, the rationalizations, the comfort-seeking, the environmental conditioning, the social normalization, the accumulating costs, the question that remains is the one most relevant to the person who is listening to this audiobook right now. Why, given that so many people recognize these patterns in themselves, do so few of them actually change? The answer is not complicated, but it is uncomfortable enough that most conversations about personal development avoid stating it directly. Most people never change because they underestimate how much change actually costs, and they overestimate the motivation that recognition alone produces. Recognition is not change. The awareness that something needs to be different does not, on its own, produce a different thing. Awareness is the beginning. It is necessary, but it is separated from actual behavioral change by a specific distance that most conversations about personal development do not honestly account for. That distance is filled with discomfort. Not the dramatic crisis-level discomfort that forces the hand, the sustained, low-level, grinding discomfort of doing difficult things consistently in conditions that do not support them for long enough that the new pattern becomes more natural than the old one. This discomfort is real. It is prolonged, and it is not reliably accompanied by the emotional reward that would make it feel worth it in the short term. Most conversations about change are actually conversations about the desire for change. They generate the feeling of wanting to be different without requiring the actual experience of the discomfort that being different demands. They produce temporary motivation, a period of heightened desire and increased effort that dissipates when it encounters the sustained, grinding reality of what change actually requires. This is the cycle that traps most people in quiet failure even after repeated genuine attempts at breaking out of it. The recognition arrives, the motivation rises, the attempt begins. The attempt meets the sustained discomfort of the transition period. The motivation, which was emotion rather than commitment, fades. The discomfort, which was real regardless of the motivation level, remains. And the combination, reduced motivation plus sustained discomfort, produces the retreat that looks like failure of capacity, but is actually failure of decision quality. The decision that produces change is qualitatively different from the intention that produces temporary attempts. It is not a feeling. It is not a response to an emotional state of inspiration or desperation. It is a committed, clear-eyed, cost-acknowledged, non-negotiable structural feature of the life being organized going forward. It is made with full knowledge that the motivation will not always be present, that the discomfort will be sustained, that the conditions will frequently not cooperate, and it remains in place not because those conditions have been met, but in spite of them. This quality of decision is what most people have never actually made. They have made conditional decisions, decisions that hold as long as the motivation is high and the conditions are favorable and the results are coming in at a rate that feels proportionate to the effort. And conditional decisions dissolve when the conditions are not met, as they reliably are not, because change does not come with favorable conditions. Change creates its own conditions from the inside through the sustained behavior that eventually produces the environment that sustains it. But that process requires getting through the period before the self-sustaining environment exists on the basis of the decision alone. The person who changes is the person who has made the non-negotiable decision and has enough honest understanding of what that decision requires to maintain it through the period when the motivation has faded and the results are not yet visible and the old default is right there, as available and comfortable as it always was. That person exists. They are not a different species. They are not operating on special resources that are unavailable to you. They have simply made a different quality of decision and understood with sufficient clarity what that decision actually means. Chapter 9. The Moment of Reckoning. At some point, not necessarily through dramatic intervention, sometimes simply through the accumulation of enough quiet dissatisfaction, the quiet failing becomes visible, not to anyone else necessarily, to you. It arrives differently for different people. For some, it is a specific birthday, a decade marker that arrives with more weight than expected and forces the comparison between the life being lived and the life that was imagined at the previous decade marker. For some, it is a conversation that lands unexpectedly honestly. For some, it is a moment of contrast, encountering someone who has built what you have been intending to build, seeing the evidence that the thing you have been waiting to do is actually doable, and feeling, in the gap between their doing and your waiting, the specific quality of loss that honest reckoning produces. For some people, the reckoning never fully arrives. The protective mechanisms are sufficiently effective, the rationalizations sufficiently comprehensive, the environment sufficiently normalized that the quiet failure never becomes visible enough to demand a response. These are not the people who arrived at this audiobook. The person who found their way here has already, on some level, begun the reckoning. The fact that the title resonated, that the description felt personally addressed, that something in the opening landed more accurately than comfortably. This is the reckoning presenting itself. The reckoning is not punishment. It is not evidence of failure in some final, irreversible sense. It is information, the most important information available to a person who wants their life to be different from what it has been. It is the moment when the gap between what is and what could be becomes visible clearly enough to be taken seriously. What matters is what happens in the moment after the reckoning becomes visible, because the reckoning, if it is not met with the specific quality of honesty and intention it requires, will be processed and metabolized and eventually rationalized back into a form that the existing pattern can accommodate. The reckoning will be acknowledged, briefly and genuinely felt, and then filed under things to address later, which is the same filing cabinet where the last reckoning went. And the last reckoning before that. The reckoning that actually changes things is the one that is met differently, not with inspiration or motivation or the excited energy of a fresh start, with the specific, quiet, honest acknowledgement that this, the current pattern, the current trajectory, the current version of a life that is smaller than it is capable of being, is not acceptable, not as a dramatic proclamation, as a simple, clear, private statement of fact that becomes the basis for the non-negotiable decision. The reckoning arrives. The choice of what to do with it is yours. You can use this audiobook a way most self-improvement content is used, as a temporary elevation of awareness that produces a brief period of increased intention and then fades back into the existing pattern, leaving the person slightly more informed about why they are still in the same place. Or you can use it as the moment of the reckoning, the moment when the honest accounting of what the quiet failure is actually costing meets the genuine understanding of what it would take to stop it, and the comparison produces a decision of the quality that produces actual change. That decision is available right now, not in some future moment when you are more ready. In this one, with the full knowledge of what it will cost and what it will produce, and why the cost is worth the production. The reckoning is here. It has been presenting itself for some time. You have been receiving it with varying degrees of honesty and varying degrees of follow-through. This is the moment to receive it differently. Chapter 10. what breaking out of quiet failure actually requires. This is the chapter that most people who arrive here want, the specific, practical account of what it takes to actually break the pattern. Not in theory, in practice, in the specific, daily, unglamorous practice of someone who has recognized the quiet failure and is genuinely committed to stopping it. The first requirement is the decision that is not negotiable, not the feeling of wanting to change, not the resolution that is made on a good day and survives until the first genuinely difficult one. A decision that is made with full knowledge of what it will cost, the discomfort, the relational friction, the sustained effort without guaranteed immediate reward, and that treats those costs as accepted rather than as conditions for reconsideration. This quality of decision is different from most people's experience of deciding to change. Most decisions to change are contingent. They are made under the implicit condition that the change will become progressively easier, that the motivation will stay high, that the circumstances will cooperate. When those conditions are not met, when the change remains difficult, when the motivation drops, when the circumstances fail to cooperate, the contingent decision dissolves, and the return to the previous pattern is reframed as a reasonable response to unreasonable conditions. The non-negotiable decision does not dissolve when conditions are not met because it was not contingent on conditions. It was made with full knowledge that the conditions would not always cooperate. It remains in place not as a feeling, but as a commitment, a structural feature of the life being built, not a mood that will be maintained as long as it feels good. The second requirement is the specific target. Quiet failure, addressed in general, is not addressed at all. The decision to stop quietly failing needs to be directed at something concrete, a specific skill, a specific habit, a specific project, a specific dimension of the life being lived that is below the standard the person actually holds themselves to. Not everything at once. That dispersal of effort is itself a mechanism of quiet failure, the attempt to improve everything simultaneously that improves nothing sufficiently. One thing, the most leveraged one, the one that, if genuinely improved over the next period, would change the most significant dimension of the picture. This specific target is what the non-negotiable decision is directed at, and the specificity matters enormously, because vague commitment to general improvement is indistinguishable in its outcomes from vague commitment to nothing. The accountability that keeps the decision non-negotiable requires something concrete enough to be evaluated, something that can be assessed honestly. Did I do it today? Did I do it this week? Is the pattern of the last month consistent with the commitment I made? The third requirement is environmental redesign. As established earlier, the environment produces behavior more reliably than willpower does. The person who has made the non-negotiable decision and identified the specific target needs to design the conditions that make the required behavior the path of least resistance rather than the path of greatest resistance. This means physical changes, the arrangement of space, the availability of materials, the removal of the specific frictions that were making the important behavior harder than it needed to be. It means digital changes, the restructuring of the device environment to reduce the automatic pull toward distraction and increase the default pull toward the work that matters. And it means temporal changes, the protection of specific time for the specific work, not as a hope that finds time when it is available, but as a structural commitment that is honored before other things compete for the same hours. The fourth requirement is the tolerance of the transition period. There is a specific window of time in the beginning of any genuine attempt to break out of quiet failure, usually somewhere between 2 weeks and 2 months, where the new behavior is being practiced deliberately and consistently. The old defaults are being actively resisted, and the results of the new behavior are not yet visible enough to provide the reinforcement that will eventually make the behavior automatic. This is the window in which most attempts fail, not because the person lacks capacity or the approach lacks validity, because the transition period is genuinely hard in a way that feels disproportionate to the visible results it is producing. The effort is high. The reward is not yet present. The old defaults are immediately available and temporarily more appealing than the new behavior, and without the understanding that this difficulty is normal expected, and specifically the period that must be survived before the new pattern becomes self-sustaining. The difficulty is read as evidence that the approach is wrong rather than as evidence that the transition is working. Surviving the transition period is a matter of understanding what it is, not a failure, not a sign that the change is not taking hold, but the normal, expected, temporary discomfort of a system in the process of reorganizing around new patterns. Every day inside the transition period is a day of building the foundation that the automatic behavior of the future will rest on. It does not feel like building. It feels like fighting. But the fighting is the building. The fifth requirement is a shorter feedback loop than most people designed for. One of the features of quiet failure that makes it so durable is that the costs are long-term, while the rewards of the behaviors that produce it are immediate. The comfort is available now. The cost of the comfort appears years later. Changing this requires creating some form of shorter-term feedback that makes the progress of breaking out visible before the long-term results arrive. This does not require elaborate systems. It requires some honest, consistent, minimally structured way of tracking whether the commitment is being honored, not to create pressure, to create visibility, to make the progress, or the absence of progress, something that can be seen and assessed and responded to while there is still time for the response to matter. Because the thing that is invisible continues on its trajectory, and the trajectory of quiet failure, left invisible, continues in only one direction. Chapter 11. The quiet success that replaces the quiet failure. There is a version of your life that does not contain the quiet failure, not a perfect version, not a version that has arrived at some imagined destination and is living there without difficulty or doubt, but a version that is genuinely not settling, that is pointed at something real and moving toward it consistently, that has made the non-negotiable decision and is honoring it in the small, ordinary moments of ordinary days. This version is not dramatically different from the current one in its external appearance. It does not look like transformation. It looks like Tuesday, like the ordinary effort of doing the ordinary things the commitment requires, like the morning that was protected, the session that happened when it did not feel like it would, the standard that was maintained when lowering it was available and appealing. The quiet success that replaces the quiet failure is as invisible from the outside as the quiet failure was, but it is completely different in its internal quality. The person in the quiet success does not feel the ambient dissatisfaction of the person in the quiet failure. They feel the specific quality of difficulty that comes from genuinely attempting something which is a different category of experience entirely, harder in some moments, more alive in others, and undergirded by the particular kind of satisfaction that only comes from sustained, genuine effort. And the trajectory is different. The quietly failing person from most distances looks fine, but the trajectory projected forward leads somewhere smaller than the person could have been. The person in quiet success also looks, from most distances, simply like someone going about their life. But the trajectory projected forward leads somewhere genuinely different from where the quiet failure was headed. The compounding works in the opposite direction. The skills accumulate rather than atrophy. The identity updates in the direction of capability rather than limitation. The time passes in the service of something being built rather than something being maintained. The gap between these two trajectories, invisible in any individual week, becomes the difference between two very different lives when enough time has passed. And the moment of divergence, the specific point where the trajectory changes direction, is almost always a moment that from the inside feels like nothing special. A Tuesday, a non-negotiable decision being honored in ordinary conditions that provide no particular support. That moment is available to you. Not in some future when you are more ready, more inspired, more certain of success, in the specific ordinary conditions of right now. The quiet failure is replaceable, not by perfection, by the quiet, daily, consistent practice of doing the things that matter in the ordinary moments of ordinary life for long enough that the trajectory changes in a direction that at some later date will be visible and undeniable and genuinely yours. Chapter 12. The Identity Beneath the Failure. There is one more thing that needs to be said, and it is perhaps the most important thing in this entire audiobook. The quiet failure is not who you are. It is what has been happening. And those two things, what you are and what has been happening, are not the same, even when they feel indistinguishable from the inside. The person who has been quietly failing for years carries, in most cases, a specific self-concept that has been built from the evidence of the failing. The evidence says you start and do not finish. You commit and do not follow through. You want things and do not build them. You have tried and not sustained. You are the person who means to and does not. And that evidence, accumulated across years of the same pattern, feels definitive. It feels like a reliable report on the nature of the person who produced it. It is not. Evidence about behavior is not the same as evidence about capacity. The pattern of behavior that produced the quiet failure was produced by specific mechanisms: the environment, the social normalization, the rationalizations, the comfort-seeking that are external to the person's fundamental capacity. They are the conditions under which the capacity was operating. And conditions that produced a certain level of output are not the same as evidence about the ceiling of the output that different conditions might produce. Every person who has broken out of a period of quiet failure has, at some point, discovered that the self-concept they had built from the evidence of the failing was not an accurate report on what they were capable of. It was a report on what they were capable of in those specific conditions, with that specific quality of decision, in that specific environment, pointed at that specific direction. Changing the conditions, the quality of decision, the environment, and the direction changes the output, and the new output, accumulating as new evidence, eventually updates the self-concept. But the updating requires the new output to exist first, and the new output requires doing something different before the self-concept supports doing something different. Which means the sequence is not believe in yourself, then try. The sequence is try without the belief, accumulate evidence through the trying, update the belief based on the evidence. This is why the non-negotiable decision matters more than the feeling that accompanies it. You do not need to believe you are capable before you begin. You need to begin. The believing follows from the beginning if the beginning is sustained long enough to produce the evidence that changes the story. The identity beneath the failure is not a failure identity. It is the identity of a person who has been operating under conditions that produced a failing pattern and who has the genuine capacity, not yet evidenced sufficiently, but genuinely available, to produce a different pattern under different conditions. You are not the pattern. You are the person who can change it. That is the truth beneath everything this audiobook has been saying. Not a comfortable truth, not a truth that exempts you from the effort, but a true truth based on what human beings actually are and what they are actually capable of when the decision is genuine and the conditions are right and the specific quality of commitment that produces genuine change is finally, honestly, non-negotiably made. The 99% are quietly failing because the conditions that produce quiet failure are the default conditions, and default conditions produce default outcomes. You are choosing something different. You are choosing to examine the default honestly, understand the mechanism clearly, make the non-negotiable decision deliberately, and build the conditions that produce a different outcome. That choice, made now and honored consistently, is the beginning of everything else. Make it. Chapter 13. The 1% Decision. This audiobook has been about the 99%. about the patterns that produce quiet failure in the majority of people who are genuinely capable of more, about the mechanisms, the stories, the environments, the social dynamics, the costs, and the specific quality of change that breaks the pattern. But every conversation about the 99% is ultimately a conversation about the 1%, not the 1% defined by wealth or status or visible achievement. The 1% defined by a specific quality of decision, the decision to stop drifting, to stop settling, to stop managing the gap between what is and what could be with comfort and rationalization, and the perpetual deferral of the beginning. The 1% decision is not made by people with exceptional willpower. It is not made by people with unusual talent or perfect circumstances or a level of motivation that sets them apart from everyone else. It is made by ordinary people, people with complicated histories and imperfect starting positions in the same pull toward comfort that everyone feels, who have simply made the comparison honest enough to find the quiet failure unacceptable. The comparison is simple once it is made honestly. On one side, the life of quiet failure, comfortable in the short term, costly in the long term, the slow erosion of standards, the accumulating gap between what is and what could be, the time passing without the trajectory changing, the identity built from the evidence of not following through, the possibility contracting with every year the pattern continues. On the other side, the cost of the non-negotiable decision, real and sustained discomfort, the relational friction of growing past the social normal, the difficulty of the transition period, the effort of doing hard things without immediate reward for long enough that the pattern becomes self-sustaining. When the comparison is honest, the second cost is not larger than the first. It is simply more immediate, more visceral, more present. The cost of the quiet failure is deferred, distributed across time, easy to ignore in any individual moment. The cost of change is concentrated, immediately felt, impossible to ignore. The 1% decision is the decision to prioritize the accurate comparison over the comfortable one, to feel the cost of change now and choose it anyway, because the honest accounting of what quiet failure costs over time makes it the obviously more expensive option. That decision is available to you right now, not in better circumstances, not with more motivation, not after the reckoning has been processed and the inspiration has arrived and the timing has finally aligned. In these circumstances, with whatever motivation is present, in this specific ordinary moment, the 1% is not a category you are born into. It is a category you enter through a specific quality of decision, made in a specific ordinary moment that does not feel like a turning point until enough time has passed to see that it was. This is that moment. The decision is yours. Make it. Word count 14,923, Chapter 14. The Hidden Architecture of the Average Day. Most people have never examined their day with the precision of an honest engineer. They move through it. They respond to it. They get to the end of it and feel, in varying degrees, like they did what they could. But the specific architecture of the average day, the actual allocation of hours, the specific sequence of choices, the precise pattern of where attention goes and what it produces, is rarely examined with the kind of clinical honesty that would reveal what it is actually building. Here is an exercise that most people will not do because the results are too uncomfortable. Take a typical day, not a bad day, not a crisis day, an ordinary representative day, and account for the hours, not in the vague impressionistic way that most self-assessment happens, but specifically. What time did the day begin and with what before any deliberate choice was made? Where did the first 2 hours actually go? What percentage of the working hours was spent on the things that matter most versus the things that are most immediately demanding? What happened between the end of formal work and sleep? What was the quality of attention in each period? Genuinely focused, partially distracted, substantially distracted, effectively absent. For most people, this accounting reveals something uncomfortable. Not that the day was obviously wasted. It was not. Things happened. Effort was applied. The basic responsibilities were managed, but the ratio of time spent on things that are building the desired future to time spent on things that are maintaining the current present is, for most people, far more skewed toward maintenance than they would acknowledge if the accounting were not specific. And here is the particularly uncomfortable part of the accounting. The maintenance itself is often not genuinely satisfying. The hours spent scrolling were not deeply enjoyable. The passive entertainment was not deeply restorative. The social media consumption did not produce the connection or information or inspiration that would justify the attention it consumed. The maintenance was not even pleasurable maintenance. It was just the familiar default, absorbing hours that could have been differently used, producing nothing particular but preventing the discomfort of the alternative. This is the hidden architecture of the quietly failing day. Not dramatic waste, gradual dilution. The slow distribution of hours across things that matter somewhat, things that do not matter much, and things that do not matter at all in proportions that feel reasonable in any individual moment and look in aggregate like a life that is spending most of its available time on everything except the things that would actually change it. The architecture can be changed, but it cannot be changed without first being seen. And seeing it requires the specific discomfort of the honest accounting, not the retrospective impression of how the day went, but the specific, detailed, hour-by-hour reckoning with where the attention actually lived. Do the accounting, not as punishment, as the first act of genuine architectural redesign, because you cannot build a different structure on a foundation you have not honestly examined. Chapter 15. The patterns that survive every attempt. There is a specific experience that anyone who has made multiple genuine attempts to break out of quiet failure will recognize. The attempt begins. The pattern changes, briefly and genuinely. Something different happens for a week, or 2 weeks, or even several months. And then, not with a dramatic collapse, not with a clear reason, not with any obvious moment of failure, the pattern reasserts itself. The old behavior returns. The new structure quietly dissolves, and the person finds themselves back in the same place, with the additional weight of another failed attempt adding to the identity of someone who tries and does not sustain. This is one of the most demoralizing features of quiet failure, its resilience. Its ability to survive sincere, genuine, effortful attempts to replace it. And understanding why this happens is essential to making the next attempt different from the previous ones. The pattern survives because it is rooted at multiple levels simultaneously, and most attempts address only one level. The behavioral level is the one most attempts address. Change the behavior. Do the workout. Write the chapter. Protect the morning. These behavioral changes are real and necessary, but they are the surface layer of the pattern. Beneath the behavior is the environment that produces it. And if the environment has not been redesigned, if the phone is still accessible at the moment of temptation, if the food is still in the kitchen, if the structure of the day still makes the old behavior the path of least resistance, the behavior will revert to the default when the willpower that was maintaining the change runs out. Beneath the environment is the identity, and if the identity has not been updated, if the person still at the operational level believes themselves to be someone who does not follow through, whose motivation always fades, whose good intentions reliably dissolve, then the identity will produce behavior consistent with itself regardless of the environmental design and the behavioral intention. And beneath the identity are the stories, the specific, personally tailored narratives about why the change is particularly difficult for this particular person, about why the circumstances are uniquely constraining, about why the fundamental limitations make the desired level of performance genuinely unavailable. If the stories have not been examined and challenged, They continue to generate the identity that generates the behavior that produces the pattern. Most attempts at change address the behavior and maybe the environment. Very few address the identity. Almost none address the stories. And so the pattern survives, because its roots go deeper than the level at which the attempt is being made. The attempt that breaks the pattern is the one that goes all the way down. That does not just change the behavior, but redesigns the environment, challenges the identity, and examines the stories with enough honest attention that their hold is genuinely loosened. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic confrontation, but consistently, persistently, in the ordinary moments when the pattern is trying to reassert itself and the choice of whether to let it is actually available. Chapter 16. The Compound Interest of Small, Honest Choices. There is a mathematical principle that most people understand intellectually, and almost none apply with sufficient consistency to feel its full effect. Compound interest. In financial terms, compound interest is the mechanism by which small amounts of invested money, left to grow without interference across sufficient time, produce returns that are dramatically larger than the principle would suggest. The growth is not linear, it is exponential. And the exponent only becomes visible after enough time has passed for the compounding to become undeniable. The same mechanism operates on behavior. Small, consistent, honest choices, made in the ordinary moments of ordinary days without drama or announcement, in the direction of the person you are choosing to become, compound across time in exactly the same way that financial investments do. The early returns are modest and invisible. The medium-term returns are visible, but not yet dramatic. The long-term returns are the unmistakable evidence of years of compounding, a skill that is genuinely developed, a body that is genuinely different, a life that is genuinely pointed somewhere, an identity that is genuinely updated by the accumulated evidence of having shown up. The tragedy of quiet failure, understood through this lens, is that it is the compound interest of small, dishonest choices working in the opposite direction. Every small capitulation to the comfortable default, every minor rationalization, every marginal lowering of the standard. These compound, too, in the direction of reduced capacity, narrowed possibility, a smaller version of the life that was originally available. The investment that breaks out of quiet failure is not a dramatic, large-denomination single transaction. It is the daily, small-denomination choice to be honest with yourself in the moment when honesty is less comfortable than the alternative, to maintain the standard when lowering it would be easier, to do the thing when not doing it would be immediately more pleasant, to stay in the difficulty when leaving it is available. These choices are not impressive individually. They are not shareable. They do not produce visible results in the days they are made, but they compound. Across weeks, the compounding is barely visible. Across months, it begins to be felt. Across years, it produces something that cannot be denied. A different person in a different position, with a different relationship to their own capacity and their own future. This is the investment strategy of breaking out of quiet failure, not the dramatic gesture, the small, honest choice made consistently, over enough time that the compounding produces something real. The question is not whether you are capable of the dramatic gesture. The question is whether you are capable of the small, honest choice today, in the specific, ordinary moment when it matters. You are. The question is whether you will. Chapter 17. Listening to this was not enough. You have been listening to this audiobook for some time now. You have encountered in some detail the mechanisms of quiet failure, the specific costs it carries, the stories that sustain it, the environmental conditions that produce it, the social dynamics that normalize it, the quality of decision that breaks it, and the specific requirements of the change that replaces it. None of that was enough. Knowing all of this, understanding the mechanism, recognizing the pattern, feeling the weight of the honest accounting, None of it changes anything on its own. The person who finishes this audiobook with a deep understanding of quiet failure and no change in their daily behavior is still quietly failing. The understanding is more sophisticated, the failure is not less real. This is not a criticism, it is a structural feature of the problem. Knowledge about the pattern is not the same as the change of the pattern. Awareness of the cost is not the same as the decision to stop paying it. Recognition of the mechanism is not the same as the redesign of the conditions that produce it. What changes things is not the knowing, it is the doing. The specific, particular, concrete action that is taken today, not eventually, not when the motivation arrives, not when the circumstances improve, but today, in this ordinary moment, on the basis of what this audiobook has revealed. What is the one thing that the honest accounting of this audiobook reveals as the most significant specific target for your particular quiet failure? Not a general intention to be better. The specific thing, the specific daily behavior that, if changed, would most significantly alter the trajectory of the next year. The specific standard that has been allowed to erode that most needs to be restored. The specific project that has been deferred longest that most needs to be begun. Name it, not out loud if that feels uncomfortable. Privately, specifically, with the honest acknowledgement that this is the thing, not one of many things, the thing, and then begin it. Not perfectly, not with the full motivation that perfect conditions would produce, with whatever is actually available right now. Imperfectly, inadequately, without guarantee of sustaining it, without certainty of success. Begin, because beginning, actual, specific, immediate beginning, is the only thing that this audiobook, this recognition, this reckoning, can produce that will actually matter. Everything else is conversation, and you have had enough conversations. The quiet failure ends when the doing begins. Begin. Chapter 18. The version of you that is not in the 99%. There is a version of you that this audiobook has been pointing toward without naming directly across all of its chapters. Not the perfect version, not the finished version, not the version that has solved everything and arrived at the destination and is living there without difficulty. The version that is simply no longer quietly failing. This version still has hard days, still faces resistance, still encounters the familiar pull of the comfortable default when the important behavior is right there, available and difficult. Still has weeks where the pattern slips and has to be caught and redirected. Still carries the ordinary weight of the human life being lived with genuine effort in conditions that do not always cooperate. But this version has something that the quietly failing version does not have. A direction, a real one, a direction that is visible not in any individual day, but in the trajectory of the months, in what has been built and developed and changed and grown since the non-negotiable decision was made and the small, honest choices began to compound. This version knows from direct experience rather than hopeful theory what they are capable of when they actually try. When the trying is sustained, when the conditions are designed to support it, when the decision is the kind that does not dissolve when the motivation fades. This version has updated their self-concept on the basis of genuine evidence, the evidence of the months since they stopped quietly failing, and the updated self-concept produces a fundamentally different relationship to subsequent difficulty, not the absence of doubt, the presence of evidence that doubt is not the final word. This version is not years away. It is not contingent on circumstances improving or internal states achieving some threshold of readiness. It is the version that begins to exist the moment the non-negotiable decision is made and the first small honest choice is honored. You are one decision away from beginning to be this version, not from being this version completely. That takes time and sustained effort, and the specific compounding that months of consistent, small, honest choices produce, but from beginning to be it. from the first day of the trajectory that leads there. One decision, made now, in this ordinary moment. The version of you that is not in the 99% is not waiting for you to be ready. It is waiting for the decision. It has always been waiting for the decision you did not make the last time the reckoning arrived, the decision you postponed the time before that, the decision that has been available in every reckoning that has ever presented itself, and that has consistently been met with something softer than the decision itself. Meet it differently this time, not because you feel differently, not because the circumstances have changed, because you understand, now, with more clarity than before, what the quiet failure is actually costing, and because that understanding, honestly received, makes the comfortable default genuinely less acceptable than it was before this audiobook began. The decision is available. The version of you that makes it is the version that is not in the 99%. Be that version. Chapter 19. The Day the Quiet Failure Ends. The day the quiet failure ends does not feel like a turning point. It feels like Tuesday. It feels like the ordinary, unremarkable moment of a person making the ordinary choice to do the thing they said they would do in conditions that provide no particular support or inspiration, because the decision they made was the kind that does not require conditions to honor it. There is no fanfare, no visible evidence that anything has changed. The world looks the same. The circumstances are the same. The feelings are largely the same. The familiar pool of the comfortable default is present and familiar, and as immediately available as it always was. The only thing that has changed is the choice, and the choice that was made in that specific ordinary moment begins the compounding that will eventually produce something visible. Not today, not this week, but eventually, because the choice repeated in the next ordinary moment and the next accumulates across time into the trajectory that is genuinely different from the one the quiet failure was producing. The day the quiet failure ends is today, not because something dramatic has happened, because you have decided, with a specific, honest quality of decision that produces actual change, that it ends. The 99% will continue. The conditions that produce quiet failure are the default conditions of modern life. They will keep producing what they have always produced in everyone who does not make the specific quality of decision that this audiobook has been about. You are making that decision now. The quiet failure ends today. The work begins today. The work begins today. The version of your life that is not quietly failing begins today. Not perfectly, not without difficulty, but genuinely, honestly, with the full weight of a decision that was made clearly and will be honored consistently, today. Word count 14, 80, 90, 91, Chapter 20. The invisible wall between where you are and where you could be. There is a wall between the life you are living and the life you are capable of living. It is not made of circumstance. It is not made of other people's decisions or the randomness of luck or the advantages you were not given. It is made of something much more personal and much more addressable than any of those things. It is made of the accumulated small choices to not push through it. Every day in which the wall is approached and the retreat is chosen adds another layer, not dramatically. The wall does not visibly thicken in any individual moment, but the cumulative layers built across months and years of consistent retreat produce something that begins to feel structural, fixed, evidence of where the boundary of your life actually is, rather than where the boundary of your courage currently sits. The distinction matters enormously. A structural boundary cannot be changed, but a boundary built from accumulated retreats is not structural, it is behavioral. And behavioral boundaries can be changed by changing the behavior, specifically by approaching the wall and, instead of retreating, pushing through. The pushing through is not a single dramatic act. It is not the one moment of courage that changes everything. It is the first of a series of pushings through, each one making the next marginally easier, each one adding new evidence to the self-concept, each one compounding with the ones before it to produce a genuinely different relationship to the wall. Most people never find out what is on the other side of their wall. Not because the other side is inaccessible, because the approach has consistently produced retreat before the wall was actually tested. The retreat happens in anticipation of the difficulty of pushing through, based on the previous experiences of approaching and retreating. Without the information that would actually be most relevant, what happens when the approach is sustained past the point where retreat was previously chosen? The information on the other side of that point is the most valuable information available to a person who wants to stop quietly failing, because it reveals the actual boundary rather than the imagined one. And the actual boundary, located by genuine sustained effort rather than anticipated in imagination, is almost always further than the person who has been retreating consistently would have predicted. You have been approaching the wall and retreating. The quiet failure is, in part, the accumulated evidence of the retreats. It is time to find out where the wall actually is, not by working yourself into a state of motivational intensity sufficient to crash through it in one go, but by consistently, patiently, persistently approaching and not retreating, by making the non-negotiable decision and honoring it in the moments when retreat is available, by allowing the wall to be tested, genuinely and sustained, for long enough that its actual location is revealed. The wall is not where you think it is. It is further. You have not tested it at full capacity. You have tested it at the capacity of someone who is already planning to retreat. Test it differently. The result will surprise you. Chapter 21. What you already know. There is something you already know that this audiobook has not told you. You already know what the primary thing is, the thing that has been on the horizon longest, the thing that would most change the picture if it were genuinely built, the skill, the project, the habit, the standard that you have been approaching and retreating from consistently, that has been on the list and off the list and back on the list, that produces a specific feeling, part longing, part guilt, part something that might be called preemptive grief for the version of your life that keeps not being built. You know what it is. You have known for a long time. The information this audiobook provided was not about identifying the target. You already knew the target. The information was about understanding why you keep not reaching it and what the reaching actually requires. You have that information now, which means the only remaining variable is the decision, the specific quality of non-negotiable decision that this audiobook has been describing, the one that is made with full acknowledgement of its cost without the conditions that would make the cost comfortable, without the guarantee that the circumstances will cooperate, or the motivation will stay high, or the results will arrive quickly enough to feel proportionate to the effort. The one that is made anyway, because the comparison between what the quiet failure costs and what the change costs has been made honestly, and the comparison comes out the same way every time it is made honestly. The quiet failure is more expensive. You know this. You have known this. The knowing has not been the problem. The quality of the decision has been the problem. The contingency of the previous decisions, the conditions they placed on themselves, the implicit promises they made about staying in place if the going got too hard too quickly. Make the different decision now. Not a decision to try, a decision to do. Not a decision to do until it gets hard. A decision to do because it is hard, and hard things done consistently are what the life you want is built from. You already know everything you need to know. The only thing that was missing was the honest account of what the quiet failure was actually costing, which this audiobook provided. Now you have that too. There is nothing left to wait for. The decision is the last thing. Make it.